My name is Jon Grandage. We're here today at the State Library and Archives of Florida in Tallahassee. Today we're here to talk about some of the early Florida constitutions. So the first document I have here, and it's very special that we have this here at the archives right now, it's on a loan from the Florida Historical Society in Cocoa. This is what's known as the Patriot Constitution of 1812. Now there's a lot of history behind this particular document. In 1812, a group of Georgia settlers known as the Patriot Army invaded northeastern Florida, and they were operating with the assistance of citizens who were living in Spanish Florida. At that time, Florida was still a colony of Spain. And throughout the entire Spanish Empire, there were independence movements that had originated in the late 18th century and the early 19th century. By the time that this document was created, Mexico, for example, had already become independent. Simon Bolivar and the folks down in South America were operating to achieve independence as well. And the motivation for this particular group of individuals was that they were going to come into Florida. They were primarily from Georgia. And they were going to come into Florida, and they were going to encourage the citizens of Spanish Florida to rise up against their government and proclaim independence. When they came across the St. Mary's River, which is the boundary between Georgia and Florida, they entered into the city of Fernandina. And the people there, the Spanish government in control, was of the opinion that it would be much easier for them to just let these patriots occupy their city. And so they occupied Fernandina without firing a shot at all. And the patriots then were going to make a move on the city of St. Augustine, which was protected by a large stone fortress known as the Castillo de San Marcos. When they approached the city of St. Augustine, the military commanders in that city let it be known to the patriots that they weren't going to allow them to take control of St. Augustine. There was some periodic fighting that took place. The most significant fighting that took place in this Patriot Rebellion was when those patriots moved on some Seminole and free black towns that were located in the interior portion of the northern Florida Peninsula around what is today known as the Paynes Prairie. At that time it was known as Alachua. The Patriots were defeated in their fighting against the Seminoles. They eventually moved back to Fernandina, where they determined that this project was a complete failure and that they had failed to achieve their objective of taking a portion of Florida. And what they ultimately wanted to do when they took over Fernandina and their plan to take over St. Augustine was that as soon as they became in charge of that area, they would cede it to the United States. They would immediately transfer that territory to the United States, and then the Republic of East Florida would become another territory of the United States. And so they created, in the time in which they were in Florida and in control of Fernandina, they created what's known as their Constitution, the Patriot Constitution. And the document is very similar to the United States Constitution. It was directly influenced by that document, and it is very, very similar in form and function. It granted citizenship to white men over the age of 21. That's the only people who could vote. And it was very specific that most of the people who would make up this government, which would be short-lived anyway, had to have taken a role in the rebellion against the Spanish. Well, it was never really enforced at all, and because the individuals, the so-called patriots, were not officially acting on the part of the United States government, and since they never took control of Spanish Florida, the Constitution really never had any significant impact whatsoever on the form of government in what was at that time Spanish Florida. Now, as the territorial government started to form, the drive towards statehood occurred about 15 years after Florida became a territory. The document that we have here is the 1838 Constitution of Florida. This is the first constitution that was drafted in anticipation of Florida becoming a state. So in 1838, a group of delegates met at St. Joseph's. This is a site along the coast. It's a port city along the coast southwest of Tallahassee. And it's a very small area, but it was very important in the time, and it was kind of a rival port city to Apalachicola, which was a major port city on the Florida Panhandle. So delegates came from West Florida, they came from East Florida, and they were selected to serve on different committees depending on their area of expertise. One of the major controversies surrounding the Constitutional Convention was the issue of banking in Florida. There's quite a lot of articles in the Constitution that attempted to regulate banking in what would become the state of Florida. There was a very big interest among Floridians from keeping a lot of outside of the state controlled banks from establishing themselves in the territory. They were quite adamant about keeping land speculation to a minimum. And in effect, the territorial government wanted to be the ones who were handling a lot of the land dealings. Now, the document itself, this is the first portion of it. It's a very long document, and we're looking at one of the top of it, so the very top of it, and if we were to lay it out, it would extend across this entire table. This is also unusual because this is the only known copy to exist of the 1838 Florida Constitution. It's believed to be a secretary's copy, and the secretary in this case would be the Secretary of the Constitutional Convention. There's a lot of interesting provisions in this document. It's very similar in form and function to the United States Constitution and also to the constitutions of Georgia and South Carolina. There were specific laws in here aimed at limiting the ability for the state government to emancipate slaves. They also did what they could to limit the extent of free blacks from moving into the territory. So it set up the terms for the governor. Governor was elected every 4 years. The House of Representatives would be elected every year, and then the Senate would have 2-year terms. So it did create a Senate and a House. 7 years would pass before Florida would become a state, and that has to do with the fact that at the time, states were admitted into the Union in pairs, one slave state, one free state. So when Florida was admitted as a slave state in 1845, Iowa came into the Union as a free state. So the next document that we have is what's known as the Florida Ordinance of Secession. Much like the 1838 Constitution, this is the only known copy of the ordinance that is in existence. Now, this particular piece is on a vellum type paper, and as you can see, there's quite a lot of damage to the original document. For many years, this hung in the hall of the Florida House of Representatives. It's a remarkable document for insofar as it's the only copy known to exist. You can see some of it is peeling off, and it was very clear what the ordinance did in the context of Florida, and you can see here it's dated January 10th, 1861. So this is the document that severed the ties between what at that time was the state of Florida and the United States government. Now, when the Civil War ended in 1865, the state of Florida became part, as with the other southern states, of being under federal control. Now, immediately upon the possession of Florida by the federal government, they drafted what is known as the 1865 Constitution. And its major contribution to Florida's political history was to abolish the Florida Ordinance of Secession. So in essence, this document said the secession, which had been illegal and so on under from the perspective of the federal government, was hereby nullified. And then this Constitution would be what they were trying to work out, what Florida's government would look like once it re-entered the Union. And so a lot of this document, the 1865 document, very much resembles the 1838 document. There wasn't a lot that was going to change. However, the most important thing that was going to change is that slavery would be abolished in the state of Florida. Now, the next document is the 1868 Constitution. And this is very significant because this is the Constitution that was enacted in Florida during Reconstruction. So it is the Reconstruction document. Now, when Florida was readmitted to the Union, this is the Constitution that was accepted by the federal government. So it had to abolish slavery, the 13th Amendment. It had to accept the 14th and 15th Amendments in order for Florida to be readmitted into the Union. So this document, in effect, granted a lot of political rights to African Americans that prior to this time they had been expressly denied by the words of the 1838 Constitution. And when Florida became part of the Union again, there was a short-lived time, much like in the other southern states, where African Americans were elected to positions of power within the state government. There were African Americans from Florida who served in the United States House of Representatives, for example. there were many African Americans that served in the Florida House and the Florida Senate. And these would be the only African Americans to serve in those positions well into the 20th century, following the implementation of Jim Crow laws and a lot of the history of segregation that would come later in the 19th century. The 1868 Constitution, from the perspective of many Floridians, would be looked upon as a terrible document. The vast majority of political power in the state after Reconstruction ended was still vested with the white, primarily individuals who had been involved in the slaveholding and in railroads and in banking and some of the other large industries. And so the 1868 Constitution, from the perspective of those individuals, something they wanted to reverse almost immediately. But it did take some time. The federal government occupied Florida until into the 1870s, and the individuals who were in power, who were Floridians, so not the people who had been federal agents, in essence, in Florida, they wanted to try to reverse this and strip back some of the rights that had been granted to African Americans in the wake of the Civil War. So this document, in essence, undid a lot of what the 1868 document did. For example, it established poll taxes. These were taxes that were placed on voting throughout the South and throughout other parts of the country as well, so that poor whites and also African Americans were prevented from voting, in essence disenfranchised, because they would have to be required to pay a small amount of money when they came to vote. There's also another provision, a very specific one, saying that it was illegal for African Americans and whites to live together or to marry one another. So by the time then we get into the 20th century and the most recent revisions to the Constitution, you're still working very much on a framework that had been established during the territorial period. There's little tweaks here and there, how long representatives would serve, different things about districting, banking, and infrastructure, but much of the framework established in 1838 remained in place until the 20th century, when we had this major revision that really brought Florida's Constitution into a modern period and reflected the massive economic and demographic changes that took place in the state in the 20th century.